Why the voting algorithm when combined with displays of power will be effective where other methods have failed. This video is about understanding why this movement is constructed as it is. It is broken into several parts because this is going to be a deep dive into understanding the challenges we face and why we can absolutely overcome them if we adopt this new strategy. If you are skeptical that this new strategy will work, we ask you to consider listening to the end of this presentation. We will probably produce this as both a series of videos and as one longer video depending on how people want to digest the content. We are first going to discuss the reasons why most grassroots political movements fail. Then we are going to discuss how we change our tactics to counter these challenges. Then we will discuss what should be the result of those changes, and the one factor that is most important in making our new strategy work. After that we will discuss 9 different tactics the establishment will likely use to counter our new political strategy. Then we will discuss why the manner we have constructed our strategy addresses each of these tactics. At that point we will discuss the positive benefits of directly supporting 1984 No More candidates to supplement our strategy. Then we discuss what could go wrong and the fatal flaws with logic-based strategies and game theory and how we account for those and even put them towards our advantage. Finally, we will give you a vision as to what our winning actually looks like. Let's start by discussing some of the many reasons that political movements fail. Problem number 1: money and influence. Any person running for office really needs to create name recognition for himself in order to get elected. While this is certainly true to some extent in any election, the first-past-the-post winner-take-all system ensures this to be true. We talk a lot about this on our video discussing ordered choice voting and how to change it. But to restate what we have said there, people have been taught by this system that voting for someone without massive name recognition essentially wastes your votes, taking away from a candidate more likely to defeat the person you hate most. Thus, people generally vote for the lesser of 2 or 3 evils. This is because rarely does one really like the candidates that have name recognition to be elected. They are forced on the people by campaign finances. This is because those people with name recognition get it from one of 2 places: 1, corporate media, and 2, paid advertisements. The corporate media will generally promote the establishment candidates while trying to ignore or undermine people who speak against their narratives. For example, a person talking about holding pharmaceutical companies accountable for injuries caused by their products is not likely to get a chance to speak on a network who accepts millions of dollars in paid ads from those same companies. For the second source of name recognition, it takes a lot of money to run paid advertisements, especially for statewide or national campaigns. That generally comes from large corporate donors or very wealthy individuals who want to ensure that those candidates remember who helped them get elected. Most people who would like to run for office to create a better world do not have this kind of money. Ironically, a lot of campaign finance laws actually tend to make it more difficult to raise money from normal people since they do not have access to the types of campaign finance lawyers and support from large super PACs that are used to get around these laws. And for third-party candidates, many jurisdictions have significant signature petition requirements that costs a lot of time or money to hire petition gatherers just to get on the ballot. Having a lot of money has thus become a prerequisite to get elected. Being rich or indebted to rich people should not be a pre-qualification to be a candidate. Neither should being chosen by the corporate media, which is controlled by one of 5 major corporations indebted to big business for their advertising revenues. Even if the grassroots can crowdfund a lot of money behind one person, you really need to fund enough people to fill at least half of Congress to get any meaningful reform. This simply is not possible in a system dominated by money and corporate media influence. Now our agenda introduces a lot of process-based reforms such as ordered choice voting, proportional representation, and enhanced ballot access to hopefully mitigate these problems after our agenda is approved. This is particularly true as people start to make use of candidate matching software that these reforms will make practical for the first time. However, these problems must be dealt with head-on before we can get our agenda adopted. Solely relying on head-to-head competitions under the current system is simply not a realistic way to achieve the sort of supermajority victory we need to put through constitutional reforms. The next factor we have to deal with is corruption. Even if money was not an issue, there is still the problem of government corruption. This is largely a side effect of money, incentivizing politicians to maximize the money they can get from their position over ethics. Politicians in charge often refuse to play by their own rules. This is not theory. There are plenty of real-life examples to show the express rules for thee, and not for me is a common attitude among government officials. So, let's say you have a group of honest candidates that are going to change the system. Political leaders without morals can kill, arrest, threaten, kidnap, bribe, smear, cancel, and blackmail those that threaten their power. Such people can make sure their henchmen that carry out these acts on their behalf will never be held accountable if proper checks on power are not put into place. They can even approach people in the press putting out blatantly false stories about opposing candidates. In fact, in many cases you might only need stories with a little bit of truth taken out of context by withholding important information to make opponents look bad. Without the money for advertisement and supporters in the press, most people will probably never even hear the truth or other side of the story. This is one of the reasons movements based on leaders are doomed to fail. They will likely be killed, imprisoned, unjustifiably discredited or coerced out of the race. Let's be real. Countries rarely function as lined out in your high school civics book. The real world tends to be messy and corrupt, particularly when people threaten real change. A corrupt establishment will try to do things with as light a touch as possible, i.e. bribing and threatening before killing to minimize the chance of stoking public outrage. But a psychopath in power will act without mercy to protect his or her position or power if they think it is really threatened. As alluded to earlier, ballot access is also very difficult in many places if you are not a member of one of the major political parties. You might have to go out and get thousands of signatures, which costs a lot of time or money. And when done, corrupt judges and elections officials can attempt to kick any candidate they think is a reasonable threat off the ballot. They literally can arbitrarily throw out perfectly good signatures or coming up with obscure legal ruling to justify doing so. This happened just recently in Ohio when Secretary of State Frank LaRose tried to arrange a kangaroo court to boot his independent opponent off the ballot. So, if you want to form an independent political party, good luck with that. You will likely run into the same issues in many nations that claim to be democratic republics. That is a losing strategy. And, if your movement relies on the honesty, integrity, and vision of one man or a small group of men, it is likely to fail. Sure, good people can be elected to legislatures and some positions. But the establishment cannot tolerate enough of these candidates to make a difference. If people can be kept off the ballot, disappeared, bribed, and blackmailed, a movement cannot rely on electing good people to institute change. We can come up with tons of real-life examples, but we want to prove it to you in a way you cannot deny. You will see how by the end of this video. And most people really know this in their gut, which is the reason they have completely given up on any hope of political change. That is why we are here to offer you another option. A change of tactics. If you cannot reliably vote in the good people, you can certainly vote out the bad people. And we are not just talking about one side of the political aisle or the other. We are talking about the vast majority of people in all the major parties. They all are in some way complicit in the system, even though not all of them will have the psychopathic tendencies of those that wield the most power. If you hang around a corrupt system long enough, you will no longer recognize the corruption. You will accept it as the way things are and be desensitized to the reality of the situation. Those large campaign checks from corporate lobbyists will help that process a lot. I assure you most of these people in government who are being influenced by money probably do not even consider themselves corrupt. The influence of money can be subtle and subconscious, especially if you live in an echo chamber with other politicians and corporate reporters. Now, this is not a new idea. People have suggested voting everyone out for a long time. Throw all the jerks out, is a common political trope. But it fails for many of the same reasons that boycotts fail. There is no strategy to it. You have to have an actual plan that gives people hope that voting everyone out makes a difference. You need a specific reason most people can agree with. Furthermore, you need a stated goal that a group can agree with that they feel is achievable. Because without that, you are just going to get a small number of random people voting against incumbents that is barely noticeable. You are not going to overcome the bipartisan fear of the other side being worse than Hitler, and this is the most important election ever, so don't throw away your vote. But let me ask you this. Has a candidate that you thought was the end of the world ever gotten elected? Did the world end? Was it really as bad as everyone expected? Sure, you might not have liked it, but you probably did not like when your guy was in there either. He was just the lesser of the two evils. We all want better choices, which the current system is not giving us for reasons I just outlined. Do you want to keep playing this game? Insanity is doing the same thing over and over again and expecting different results. So, what we have in this movement is a specific, reasonable goal. We are not just generally upset at government. We are pointing to a specific set of things we want remedied. This is an agenda that should be common sense and receive vast bipartisan support. For example, who can be against ordered choice voting and a citizen's veto? Most people, whether on the political left or right, will want to have more of a voice in how their government functions. The only people who would not want this are the politicians who fear their power and electoral advantage evaporating overnight once this happens. There is an important factor to consider as well. Politicians need hope too. If you just say, vote everyone out without any consensus rationale or terms for a truce, they have no reason to change how they vote. You cannot just be generically against corruption and bad government. You have to put forth concrete ways of correcting it so politicians have hope of getting re-elected. If you want them to change, you have to tell them exactly what to do to get your vote. And on the people's side, if no one has a goal for an end result, why on earth should they participate in a broad boycott of incumbents? This is the reason no one takes the calls to toss them all seriously. There is no strategy behind it. There might even be completely disagreement over what people are unhappy with. Liberals and conservatives will have different perspectives. So, what we do is find a common cause that allows us to all present a unified message to politicians, one that will meaningfully reduce the institutional corruption in the system if implemented. And we can table all the policy issues we disagree with until a government in place that is capable of making the policy changes we desire for the benefit of the people and not big money donors. An analysis of expected results. Let's assume first that elected representatives actually believe they are to represent their constituents over their own interests. Common sense proposals such as ordered choice voting and proportional representation can only hurt politicians and mainstream political parties while benefiting the people. Everyone should rush to pass this legislation if they actually want to do what is in the best interests of their constituents. There have been calls for this for years, and the issue of proportional representation actually became a topic in a 2022 French presidential debate between Macron and Le Pen. But this rarely gets enacted because most establishment politicians are actually self-interested and know it will put them at a massive disadvantage. And if common sense measures like proportional representation and ordered choice voting are rarely implemented, forget about a citizen's veto and open source voting. So, if you expect governments to enact such common sense process forms without playing hardball, you are being way too naive. If we had good politicians, we would not even need to threaten to vote out every single one of them until the people's agenda is passed. That leaves us with them putting their personal interests above the national interest. The salaries for most of these politicians are not jaw-dropping. People make a lot more in the private sector. But you make a ton of money from help from your new lobbyist friends. For a list of ways that a politician watch the video we will be putting up titled "Why Laws Will Never Eliminate Undue Influence on Legislators." That is why a citizen's veto is 100% necessary to mitigate this influence. And the reason they make this much money is the power they have to influence government policy on behalf of large corporations and other special interest groups. For many, the power and notoriety can be even more powerful motivators than money. Money only buys you so much that is meaningful for your life. Power and influence is addictive. Without being re-elected, all of that goes away. The number one thing that every elected official wants is to be re-elected or elected to a higher office. One former state house representative said the first thing he was told by his party after he came to the legislature was, "The most important thing is to get re-elected." It was not doing what is best for his constituents. It was not fulfilling his campaign promises. The most important thing was his own re-election. It is no wonder he would say a few years later that his own party was a bigger obstacle to change than the opposition party. So, if you want to motivate politicians sufficiently, you absolutely have to seriously threaten their re-election. This is one reason bills have been stopped after both houses of a legislature are bombarded with phone calls right before the vote. Politicians actually do fear getting booted from office. And, out of office they are of little use to their lobbyist friends if they have no influence. More importantly, if they are flushed down the drain with all of their colleagues, they have little hope of even being hired with a fat salary to be a lobbyist in the next Congress. Unselecting these guys as a group is so much more powerful a motivator than taking them out one by one. From a purely logical perspective, as much as the 1984 No More agenda might dramatically curtail their power, it will not completely cut off their value to lobbyists like getting collectively thrown out on their butts will. So, if faced with a credible threat of being removed from office, they should ultimately consent to the will of the masses and pass our agenda. They certainly will try to water down the agenda. However, with a lot of smart people looking over their shoulders at the final legislation, this is not going to be easy. Anything less than adopting the legislation largely as intended will bring out the purple shirts. A unified country cannot be defeated. And notice, we have not mentioned getting candidates on the ballot, campaigning, funding those campaigns, or any such activities that are difficult. Those will help, but in the long term they are not necessary to achieve our objective. That is the power of this strategy. Credible threats to unelect politicians are key. This is the one thing we must have if we are going to achieve the result we seek. If politicians are logical, the only hurdle to getting our agenda passed is getting them to actually believe that they will lose their job without question if they do not do as the voters want, as precisely spelled out in our agenda. Let me be frank. They are not going to actually believe you until we take a bunch of collective scalps at the polling booths. These people are immersed in an echo chamber of arrogant men, other politicians, the political strategists, and lackeys that live off them, lobbyists, and corporate executives. They will probably be telling each other the sea of purple means people really support some weird environmental cause or something like that. Expect them to be in denial up until the time they lose their jobs. One could consider giving politicians a few years to enact this agenda before using the hardball tactics outlined in this video. But let's be real. They are not going to do anything until after the first election we show up in force and kicking out their colleagues, so there is no reason to delay it. If you look at the last few years since the world lost its mind over COVID-19, we have never seen such a pandemic of incompetence and tone-deaf governance worldwide. This generation of politicians deserve to be thrown out towards the goal of showing them we mean business. They do not even deserve the time to enact the agenda. We need make examples of all of them. Then the people newly elected are going to know the people mean business and time will not be an excuse. There will be no excuses. But it is here the voting algorithm and displays of power will be crucial. Lobbyists and powerful people will be whispering in their ears that they can fool the people. That is why the focus on results is absolutely crucial. Without them there will be no credibility. Let us examine exactly why. The tactics politicians can use against this movement. Now we will discuss 9 tactics politicians will likely use to counter our reform movement once they start taking it seriously. Tactic number 1: blame the other side. How do you fool the people? The first thing they will no doubt try is claim they got the message and they are working on enacting our agenda. They will be reported to be making progress and there will be a lot of speeches with that theme. They will be close to a deal, and in conference all of a sudden things break down and the left and right cannot come up with a deal due to technicalities in the legislation. Each side will claim they are with the people and say the other side is obstructing the will of the people. They will then use the divide and conquer strategy to get people to vote out the other side to see the agenda enacted. Meanwhile both sides are secretly meeting together giving each other high fives thinking they have duped the people. This tactic combines well with other tactics such as take one for the team and scorched earth mentioned below. Tactic number 2: take one for the team. A constitutional amendment in most nations is really hard to pass. You only have to screw things up one step along the way, and it is game over. In the United States, the House could unanimously pass the legislation. In the Senate you might have 71-1984 no more candidates who claim they are for the policies, not because they believe it, but because they are afraid of being unelected. The powers that be then only need to convince 5 people to break their word to their constituencies to stop the amendments from going through. This is when the good old boy network comes together to find 5 people to take one for the team. They might be offered unusually large bribes or really lavish positions when they leave office. For some billionaires, they can be quite compelling. Then all House members can say, "Hey, we passed the bills. We did our jobs." 66 Senate members can say, "Hey, we voted for the bills. We are with you, so re-elect us." Then only 5 of the fake 1984 no more electors get shown the door, and the majority of the Congress is potentially still corrupt if people vote only based on the votes not the results. This same process can be taken to state houses. The House and Senate could pass the bill unanimously with the understanding enough people in 13 states would take one for the team and everyone wins. It is a lot cheaper to bribe state legislators than national legislators. Tactic number 3: fake reforms. This is one that politicians love. Politicians routinely say a bill does one thing when it does the opposite. They can put in all sorts of provisions to water it down, lengthy delays and other such tactics to mute the effectiveness of the legislation. For example, buried in a bill could be a provision that a citizen's veto cannot be used on, and then they list out a bunch of circumstances likely to satisfy their lobbyists. Look no further to the referendum provision in Article 122 of Paraguay's constitution to see all sorts of exceptions to the will of people being done. Tactic number 4: voter fraud. This will be the first tactic they deploy, probably on the very first take a scalp election. If it does not work, then they will try to find methods to better sell the lie in subsequent elections. Do you think that people who would jump over hoops just to keep people off the ballot would not resort to rigging a vote if they have means and opportunity? The mainstream media will do everything to claim the system can be trusted, otherwise the ruse of democracy goes down. However, where opportunity exists to commit fraud, fraud will often be committed by those in power if enough is at stake. We will discuss many obvious flaws in the system in future articles based on poll watcher experience. We will also share with an affidavit signed under penalty of perjury and submitted to a court by a person who claims to have stolen at least 45 foreign elections on behalf of the U.S. government while working at a firm contracting for the U.S. Central Intelligence Agency, CIA. The methods described are very credible, and we are not aware of arguments to refute any of them. Tactic number 5: dismiss the movement. Hope is a key to people taking any action. You could have a situation where 30% of the people have bought into the 1984 No More Action Plan. However, if the corporate media ignores the movement or publicly dismisses it, people might assume their numbers are much lower than they are. They can produce fake polls. They can suppress and shadow ban all pro-movement posts on the internet. If you create the illusion there is no progress being made, then that 30% begins to dwindle, and people in the movement will become demoralized, thinking, what is the point? Tactic number 6: construct straw men. 3-letter agencies will likely plant certain individuals with shady backgrounds in leadership. This can be done quite effectively by setting up someone on a YouTube channel promoting the movement and YouTube intentionally delivering a ton of pro-1984 No More content. Then the media comes out and absolutely destroys these people at the peak of their popularity, often helped by actions of the plans. They might advocate violence, make racist slurs on air, and do all manner of things to turn people off. They then make these people the representatives of the movement and shame people so they do not want to wear purple shirts anymore. This is standard operating practice, which leads directly into tactic number 7: divide and conquer. If you have a large diverse movement, you will inevitably have some very unsavory characters in it. This does not even necessarily include the straw men from tactic number 6. All men have sinned and have fallen short of the glory of God. This is distinct from tactic number 6 because instead of just demonizing the group as a whole, they demonize the person. They then pressure other outspoken people in the group to denounce them publicly, tell them to tell the world they do not want them to be part of the group. Given we are a divided society, there are going to be a lot of people that identify with that person. They will then be disgusted in the 1984 No More people who denounce that person. They will then have nothing to do with 1984 No More. You do this with enough different types of people and you have completely fractured the movement. Tactic number 8: scorched earth. This tactic can go along with all the tactics. The side in power deliberately passes really bad bills to motivate people back into a policy voting paradigm. Basically, they do what politicians have been doing for the past 3 years already. From a long-term perspective, this might be the best strategy for the elite, even though on face it is totally illogical. It makes no sense for politicians of one political faction to deliberately sabotage any change of getting elected unless they are confident of tactic number 4: voter fraud working. However, it might cost a lot more money, but you could make it worth the while of all of these people to take one for the team. The reason this works is because most people think emotionally, not logically, which will be addressed later in this video. People also tend to think short-term instead of long-term. The goal of this is to get people so tied up in fear that they abandon their commitment to voting out incumbents. This is a very real issue. Tactic number 9: attack the proposals. These will be attacks from the intelligentsia and media talking heads on the 1984 No More agenda itself. They will mostly highlight how impractical the proposals are and how having the people have more say in their lives is a bad idea. The elite know better than you, and the world would be a disaster if the people took over control of their own lives. There will be a really big dose of this, but this is the tactic that is the weakest for reasons I will describe later. These tactics countered. Hopefully some of the elements of this political change formula make sense to you now. Let's talk about how each of these tactics is countered based on our 9-step plan. If you vote out everyone based on results and not how they say they are supporter or how they vote, you automatically eliminate tactic number 1: blame the other side, and tactic number 2: take one for the team. If only results matter, then these typical tactics of politicians are not going to work. This is one reason you have to vote everyone out, even the people you like and think are with you. Moreover, politicians are going to get instant feedback every single month when they see masses of purple shirts in the streets. After that first election, when we take some high-profile scalps, those shirts will rapidly knock them out of their echo chambers and put the fear of the people into them. If scared enough, those who are in secret meetings with those taking it for the team might actually go back to that person and say, "Change your vote to save my seat," or "I am telling everyone what you got offered, because I was there, and I was offered the same thing." How would you like to spend time in a federal penitentiary? And the more elections you have, the less retirements and stupid people you are going to have to be the other 29 people that felt like directly opposing the will of the people. You are going to get new blood coming in that likely are going to want to stay a while. Can you get 1/3 of the people to take it for the team, election after election? A similar rationale can be used to counter tactic number 3, fake reforms. People will just have to be more vigilant, and people will be. Even if they censor the press and social media, some people will figure it out. All you then need is to establish a standard. For example, if someone finds some problems in the text, they start wearing an orange hat with their purple shirt. Then people, knowing what it means, are going to go up to the person with an orange hat and they are going to have a conversation. If convincing, that person will start to wear a hat and will contact other people in the movement. So, as the legislation is working its way towards a vote, or even after a vote, politicians at some point are going to start seeing purple shirts and orange hats everywhere. The display of power, as you can see, can be a very powerful communications medium to other members and the politicians, even if you have mass media censorship. It also solves tactic number 5, dismiss the movement. It is pretty hard to convince everyone with fake media reports and fake polls a movement is insignificant if people see more and more purple shirts in the street. Tactic number 4, voter fraud, is also largely mitigated if people stick to the voting algorithm. If you make a hard statement that says, "I am getting rid of all incumbents, even my best friend if applicable," then you are making a statement on most legislative elections with a single color. The only ones in doubt, at least in terms of whether the incumbent wins or not, will be races without an incumbent. The more election cycles you get running the algorithm, the less retirements you will get, and more members of the Senate with longer terms will be expelled. You will get mostly all new blood, likely to run for re-election. Most of these races will be apparent based on the color test alone. With one color we can address most races, if we stay consistent. The government will then risk an existential crisis of confidence in both the government and media. The people running the election seriously put themselves at risk of being put in jail when the people come together with everyday common men and law enforcement officials for a peaceful revolution and a revote. Look to the Romanian Revolution of 1989 as a textbook example of how this can occur when the people come together demanding change. Stroessner likewise was deposed in Paraguay that same year through peaceful means. After an obvious fraudulent election, you might even see people wearing purple shirts and red caps. As the people express, they want to see the military and cops arrest the politicians and arrange a new election based on the principles established in the 1984 No More platform. The people are sovereign after all, and any obviously fraudulent election is null and void. It is not quite as obvious, but tactic number 8, scorched earth, also is handled by the algorithm. This is because we are not just focusing on the general election. In fact, the main focus should be the primary elections. If you get rid of all incumbents in the primary, you guarantee you get rid of all incumbents in the general election. Then people can literally default back to their left-right thinking and there is little benefit to scorched earth politics. If we can keep discipline in the general elections just once, it does not take a large defection in one party to affect a general election. Even a 30% to 40% 1984 No More presence in both sides of a fair general election, you can overthrow the most entrenched incumbent in a safe district. When party members begin to figure this out, they might complain to the other side, "Look what you did." But when they keep seeing purple shirts, they will start to think, "Crap, if these people are still around, and we elect an incumbent in the primary, we are screwed." Then people who might not believe in our movement will have a huge incentive to vote against their own incumbent in the primary. The scorched earth and division will actually feed into our movement if enough of our people just stay the course. These people are more likely to vote on this emotion of fear, because the left-right mindset feeds on fear. Our people are more likely to vote on principle, assuming we can properly explain the long-term strategy to them. They can then recite this logic back to their friends, complaining to them to seed the point even further for those not so smart to think of it themselves. We could even see parties pressuring their own incumbents to exit the race in favor of a new candidate if they see the number of purple shirts growing into the general election. Are you starting to see how this methodology has been designed to work to our advantage? These are the principles behind game theory at work. The other thing added to handle tactic number 8 Scorched Earth is the automatic expiration of all legislation from 2020 onward in the platform. If legislators try to leave this out, purple shirts and orange caps come out. The fear factor will be less impactful if people know that bad policies will be immediately reversed as soon as our agenda is approved. Indeed, it could provide further motivation of people to join the movement, as there have been a lot of bad bills passed the last few years. For the good policies passed during this time frame, they just need to be repassed and agreed to by the people. If they really are popular policies, that should not be a problem. Tactic number 6 Construct strawmen and tactic number 7 Divide and Conquer require a little bit of education to counter. But if you are constructing a broad movement like this, it is possible. It is the reason you are going to hear us repeat the phrase, if FDR could work with Joseph Stalin, the number 2 mass murderer in history, we can work with anyone to save this nation, no matter what they have done. The entire inspiration from this strategy came from a moment when the question was asked, what would Jesus do? Even if you do not believe Jesus is the Son of God, most people hold him in high regard, and perhaps even as one of many avatars, an incarnation of God. The thing that he did that stood out is that he brought people together. He literally hung out with prostitutes and tax collectors, and it did not bother him at all. The only people he was really in conflict with was the oppressive religious establishment of the Pharisees. We have to do the same thing. We have to recognize that we have all done things in our lives that we regret. Sometimes horrible things. But no one, not even the elite psychopaths, are beyond forgiveness. Indeed, in their own minds they are usually not the villains, they just have a very warped vision of reality. We have to accept the whores and tax collectors in our midst to join together to fight a more noble battle. This is the message that promotes tolerance and thwarts hate. That is why the 7th step of our program deals with the attitude of how people should handle attempts at dividing us into factions. Tactic number 9 will be specifically dealt with later in this article and is the easiest to counter. Positive side benefits of running 1984 No More candidates. This strategy is not dependent on running 1984 No More candidates. However, there still is a benefit to doing so. If you actually happen to elect people who are who they say they are, they can cause a lot of havoc in the legislature. This is because part of the platform is for them to oppose all major legislation altering the status quo until the agenda is enacted. This is why Step 8 in the program is very helpful, but not strictly necessary. This is a very defendable position. I just want the people to have a say on every law. Why are you against that? Is something we can embarrass establishment politicians with on the debate floor constantly if 1984 No More candidates are elected. However, at some point the establishment will want something passed they consider important. It might not even be a bad idea. If you have a growing army of legislators who are automatic roadblocks to major legislation, that provides more reasons for others on the sidelines to give in, especially given the fact they already know their job is on the line. And in a left-right divided Senate with a supermajority cloture requirement, it does not take many people voting like this to totally destroy all meaningful legislation to the elite. It also messes up the scorched earth tactic. What use is it to buy politicians if they cannot get any corporate welfare passed? Our people can introduce gridlock to smash it in its tracks. And you do not even need to elect 1984 No More candidates for this rationale to hold. If a small handful of politicians start getting nervous about losing their job, they might be willing to do anything to save it, including backing the legislation and figuring out the same calculus described above. Obstruction is a great tool to get your colleagues to agree to save your job. The fatal flaws of game theory. There are a few flaws with logical decision models such as game theory. There is an interesting book written by former FBI hostage negotiator Chris Voss, Never Split the Difference. One of the very memorable anecdotes from it was how he would go to business schools and have mock negotiations with all these game theory experts and beat the living pants out of them and using very simple techniques. You could imagine the shock of the professors. This boiled down to one undeniable fact: people do not generally think logically, they think emotionally. Any good salesman will tell you it is not the logical arguments that will close a sale, it is the vision of what they will be getting. Logic is just a little extra something to push someone over. Often it is not even necessary. The tactic I did not address earlier, tactic number 9, attack the proposals, is based on a very logical approach to reason with people and can be refuted with better logic. This is one of the purposes of the videos we will be making. It is also not hard to point out that these elites who are supposed to be so much smarter than us, are doing some of the dumbest things you can imagine. Stupid things such as sanctioning gas from a country that is necessary to keep your economy from completely collapsing, all for the purposes of meaningless virtue signaling. These things that can only be explained in terms of politicians enriching themselves due to foreign influence operations and purely emotional decision-making. But the emotional and gut feel reaction of the people will reject tactic number 9, attack the proposals, without much trouble. People want more control over their lives. They do not like being talked down to. And while you might be able to motivate some people with fear of the masses being in control, that should be a minority given how much utter damage the current elite have shown they can do themselves. It would be pretty hard for the masses to do even worse. And it is also hard to characterize this plan as a pure democracy because representatives, not the people, still have to enact laws. Additionally, by putting peremptory challenges on the constitutionality of statutes as part of the process, we arguably have the ability to uphold the rights of the minority much better than the current legislators who routinely pass laws that are not in fact lawful under their constitutions. Citizens will at least have to consider these issues before moving forward. Median-based budgeting with unified tax offsets will bring more, not less, fiscal discipline to the government. Discipline establishment politicians have not had for decades. As much logic that has been put into this plan, even more time has been spent considering the emotional side of the equation. And believe it or not, emotion can be manipulated strongly to be in our favor. Peer pressure and personal empowerment are powerful motivators for the vast majority of people. If we create a massive movement that does bring people together, the peer pressure and abject fear of the people is going to be much more powerful than you can imagine. If you believe in the power of prayer, then that implies the ability of God to enhance the terror in these people, changing their hearts and minds. Our side can also run psychological operations on the elite the same way that the CIA and media run psychological operations on the people. That is one of the reasons we will be introducing strategic boycotts at some point. This technique is essentially a divide and conquer strategy to split the elites based on their own fears and financial interests. It also reflects their divisive politics right back at them if done right, and makes their biggest economic advantages their biggest weaknesses, mainly, economies of scale and nonlinear market dynamics. We will have more to say about this later. A broader statement on game theory and logic would be that neither work when you cannot adequately model or determine what matters to the players. Emotional decision-making is just one aspect of how this principle manifests in real life. We want to show you out of full transparency where the logic laid out above can break down and what that leads to. This article started by assuming that politicians are mainly motivated by keeping power. And usually that is correct. However, it is also possible that there are some more powerful motivations that are likely to be added in if this movement gains traction. This would be the emotion of pure fear. Not fear of the people, but fear of a very nefarious class of individuals that would do anything to keep power. These are the people the conspiracy theorists have been warning us about for years. Now we cannot say if these theories are true or not since we do not get invited to these meetings, but they could be true. And, if they are true, the people in charge would literally torture, kill, or do anything to keep their power. And maybe fear of your death or the horrific death of your family might convince politicians to vote against 1984 no more legislation even if it means these lose their power. If you want to add a spiritual element to this discussion, Satan himself or other dark interdimensional or extraterrestrial entities could literally by influencing these people. This is not to say that is happening, but only that it is a possibility to consider. When logic and obvious self-interest does not explain their actions, you must be open to every other possibility. But assuming this other factor exists, what will happen then? Well, you will have a continuous turnover of incumbents including a bunch of real 1984 no more candidates frightened to death into changing their position. It will be election after election of no change. And it will be manifestly illogical to anyone paying attention. That will be anyone in the movement, which hopefully will grow to nearly the entire society. We will not necessarily which reason we have speculated on is at play, we will only know something wicked is amiss. The result, everyone knows the politicians are not motivated by their own money and power but something else. That is the only way the logical analysis fails election after election when the will of the people is no longer in doubt. Then, essentially the entire world will know the conspiracy theorists are right in one way or another. This will have just the same consequence as them saying the incumbents won in a sea of 90% purple shirts. People will all know the democratic system is a complete and total sham. And, they will demand Nuremberg trials. Trust me, it will not end well for the people behind the curtain if this is how things end up. The people are ultimately sovereign, and they have the numbers. The elite should remember what happened to Romanian dictator Nicolae Ceausescu on Christmas 1989 in a peaceful revolution of citizens if this is where they want to take society. Many do fear this is exactly where we are headed, but there is no reason to fear. Make no mistake, if God is with us, and we come together as the people of our countries, we ultimately win. If we do not come together and instead allow fear and petty emotions to drive us, we deserve the fate we will then get. What winning looks like. So what comes next? The strategy outlined here is a short-term strategy until we have the 1984 No More agenda enacted. Just voting out the incumbent is not a sustainable strategy long-term, because to move forward with social and economic policy changes you have to start voting for people. But that can only happen when you have laid the groundwork where that is possible. The 1984 No More agenda achieves that. Proportional voting and ordered choice voting should dramatically reduce the influence of money and corporate influence in politics because people can vote their consciences. See 21st Century Voting in the 1984 No More paradigm for a description of what that can look like. In a true ordered choice voting system, all those mainstream candidates that people might hate, but feel forced to vote for so as not to waste their vote, a lot of them will be put at the very bottom of the list. With lower barriers to getting on the ballot and a legitimate chance to win as an underdog, you should get a lot of normal people running for office. These will be people of different viewpoints, not party hacks. And we can use some of the technology described under the citizen veto process to help people use open source pattern matching and artificial intelligence to help them select an ordered list closest to their personal beliefs. These systems, once utilized, should make name recognition less relevant. It will be like all these YouTube channels run by average guys doing better than the corporate ones with tons of money to spend on ads. Given a choice, people do not want to hear corporate spin. That is the reason people are increasingly tuning out corporate media. People will just gravitate towards the greater choices they are given. Proportional representation will ensure even more of these people get a voice. Thus, we should get much better choices. There will still be corruption and people trying to buy them off. However, the additional barriers like the citizens' legislature, preemptory legal challenge, and citizens' line item veto should weed out all the corporate welfare that gets stuffed into bills via influence peddling. Really bad legislation that has existed for decades will literally fall off the Federal Register as the years toll and sunset clauses are activated. The statutory code will be streamlined and made more readable for normal human beings. There will be less ridiculous laws and victimless crimes on the books because the sunset clause creates a limit on the number of laws that can be on the books. But most of all, with a movement started to break partisan divides and destroy the two-party way of viewing things, we will start to talk to each other again. Different coalitions will need to be formed to pass each bill. Compromises will need to be made, meaningful ones that make sense. We can start to build outside-the-box solutions to modern problems that enhance the competitiveness of small businesses against the corporate giants and empower the people to unleash creativity and productivity to make the world a better place. This will be the subject of the website utopiarevisited.com, which we will start to roll out after 1984 No More gains traction. In it we will describe how to prevent bank solvency crises from ruining economies. We will discuss why Bitcoin is a horrible alternative to cash, and how to construct a digital money system that can be a stable medium of exchange while protecting personal privacy. We will describe effective methods of fraud tax collection that the majority of people on the left and right will like better than the personal income tax that eviscerates our rights to privacy while being easy for billionaire families to avoid through creative tax structures like public and private interest foundations. We will describe how to avoid regulatory capture of agencies like the FDA by corporate interests. We will describe what real civil and criminal justice reform looks like. There are many solutions to modern-day problems that you will never hear because it is in no one's best interests to promote them. But we are not there yet. We have to take back the reins of our government first before moving forward with these major policy advances. So that is why this works. If you found this compelling, we urge you to go to the short video simple instructions on how to save your nation from political corruption and start acting on that plan.